Right, let's jump right in today. We're going to try to unpack eviction laws.
Okay.
And particularly how just cause and no cause evictions play out, especially in California.
Right.
We've got a pretty good stack of resources here.
Yeah.
Legal articles, real estate analyses, even some FAQs. So hopefully we can make sense of this.
Great.
And I think a good place to start is this little nugget I found. Did you know that in some states, landlords can evict you without giving a reason?
It's true. And that can be a really tough spot for renters to be in.
Yeah, it seems a little wild to me.
Yeah, definitely.
So how is California different?
Well, in California, we have pretty strong just cause eviction laws, especially if you've lived in a place for at least 12 months.
Okay.
So that means that a landlord can't just decide to end your tenancy just because they feel like it.
Right.
They need a valid legal reason to evict you.
Yeah, that seems like basic fairness. Like you wouldn't expect to get fired from a job for no reason, right?
Exactly. It's a great analogy. And in states with no cause eviction, it really leaves tenants feeling vulnerable.
Yeah, for sure.
Like they have no control over their own living situation.
Makes sense.
So California really aims to create a more stable and predictable environment for renters.
That's good. So just cause basically means there needs to be a reason
Right.
for an eviction.
A valid reason.
What counts as a valid reason?
Okay, so there are actually two main types of just cause evictions.
Okay.
We have at fault and we have no fault. And at fault just cause is all about what the tenant does.
Okay.
It's about actions they've taken that violate their agreement with the landlord.
So like classic example, not paying rent.
Exactly. That's a common one.
Makes sense.
But it could also be things like breaking the rules of your lease.
Gotcha.
So maybe you have a pet that's not allowed, or you're subletting the unit without permission.
Right.
And you could also be evicted for doing illegal activities on the property.
So basically you don't hold up your end of the bargain as a tenant.
Right.
You could get evicted for at fault just cause.
Exactly.
And that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think so.
What about the no fault category?
Okay, so this is where things get a little more interesting.
Okay.
Because with no fault just cause, it's not about anything the tenant has done wrong.
Okay.
It's more about the landlord's intentions for the property.
So wait, even if I'm like a perfect tenant, paying rent on time, following all the rules,
Yep.
I could still be evicted in California.
Yeah, that's true.
Wow.
But even in these situations, California's law offers more protection than you would find in a no-cause state.
Okay.
Some common no-fault reasons could be like the landlord wants to move into the unit themselves.
Right.
Maybe they have a family member who needs to move in. Or maybe they've decided to take the property off the rental market entirely.
Okay.
And another reason could be that they need to do major renovations that require the unit to be empty.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not my fault,
Right.
but I could still face eviction.
Yeah.
That is kind of unsettling.
It is, but it's good to be aware of it.
Yeah, I guess so. What's like the biggest difference between California and those no-cause states then?
I'd say the sense of security you have.
Okay.
In those other states, it's like constantly not knowing if you're going to get a notice for no reason.
Right.
But in California, at least you know it has to be for one of these just cause reasons.
And even the no-fault situations are more protected than in those other states.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. One of our sources mentioned relocation assistance.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Yeah, so this is one of the key protections in California.
Okay.
If a landlord's evicting you for a no-fault reason, they often have to pay you money to help you move.
Really?
Yeah.
They're making you leave and they have to pay you to do it.
It sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But it's meant to help the tenant with all the disruption and the cost of having to move.
And it could be a lot of money, we saw.
It could be a lot of money, yep. In some cases, over $20,000.
Wow, that is a lot. I bet that makes landlords think twice.
It certainly adds a level of consideration for them, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it's not even just the money, right? There are other rules, too, to prevent abuse.
Absolutely. So, for example, if a landlord says they need the unit for a family member,
Right.
they can't just kick you out and then leave it empty.
Right. So they can't just try to get a higher rent from a new tenant.
Right, exactly. They have to actually move in themselves within a certain time frame and live there for at least a year, usually.
Wow.
And there are similar rules about renovations, too. So before they can give you a notice, they have to have gotten all the permits.
So no more vague notices about renovations without details.
Exactly. And they have to give you a copy of those permits.
Oh.
And a detailed description of what they're doing.
And if they don't actually do the work.
You might even have the right to move back in at your old rent.
Wow. It seems like California really is trying to make things more fair for both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
So these just cause laws
Mm-hmm.
and all these rules around no-fault evictions,
Yeah.
they're all about protecting tenants,
Right.
but still allowing landlords to manage their property.
Exactly.
Okay. So to really see how different this is, let's look at a no-cause state for a second.
Okay.
And our sources pointed to Nevada as a good example.
All right.
So imagine you're renting month to month.
Okay.
You've been a great tenant,
Mm-hmm.
paying on time, taking care of the place, no problems.
Uh-huh.
And then boom, you get a 30-day notice to leave.
Yeah.
No reason given.
It's tough.
That's wild. And there's nothing you can do.
As long as they followed the notice rules in Nevada,
Right.
that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So you could be doing everything right
Mm-hmm.
and still just get kicked out.
Yeah.
That really shows the difference, huh?
Absolutely.
Like in California, at least you know why,
Right.
and you can try to fight it if it's not fair.
Exactly.
Okay, so we can see that California is pretty tenant-friendly, and that's largely because of this just cause thing.
Yep.
But there's another big piece of the puzzle here
Okay.
that we need to talk about,
Yes.
and that's AB 1482,
Okay.
also known as the Tenant Protection Act of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So what does AB 1482 actually do for tenants?
Sure.
And maybe go easy on the legal jargon here.
Of course. So AB 1482 was a huge change for rent control in California.
Okay.
Before this, a lot of cities and counties had their own rent control rules.
Right.
But there was no statewide standard.
Gotcha.
And AB 1482 created that standard.
Okay.
It basically sets a limit on how much rent can be increased each year.
So no more landlords just randomly raising the rent a crazy amount.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Usually the rent increase can't be more than 5% plus whatever inflation is, or 10%, whichever is lower.
Gotcha. So there can still be increases,
Yeah,
but at least it's predictable.
exactly. Before this law,
Yeah.
some tenants were seeing rent go up like 20, 30% or even more.
Wow.
And that was pushing people out of their homes.
Yeah. That makes
So this puts a limit on that.
makes things more stable.
Right.
So does this apply to all rentals in California?
That's a great question.
Like what if I'm renting a house?
Yeah, so there are some exemptions.
Okay.
For example, it usually doesn't apply to single-family homes.
Okay.
Or condos that aren't owned by corporations.
Gotcha.
And newer buildings built in the last 15 years are also usually exempt.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few other specific exemptions, like owner-occupied duplexes.
Okay, so there are exceptions,
Right.
but it still covers a lot of the rental market.
Absolutely.
Okay, so always good to check the specific laws that apply to your situation.
It's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Good advice. So I want to ask you, the listener, what surprised you the most about all this? What stood out to you about California's approach to tenant protections? Think about that for a minute, because we're going to dive deeper into the specifics of these laws and what they actually mean for you next time. Welcome back to our deep dive on evictions.
Mm-hmm.
Last time we were talking about how California's just cause rule gives tenants more stability
Right.
compared to states with no cause evictions.
Yeah.
And we also started talking about AB 1482,
Mm-hmm.
which brought in statewide rent control.
Exactly.
So that was pretty big for tenants' rights.
It really was.
But there's more to the story, right?
There is. We can't forget about some of the updates and changes that happened since then.
Right.
Like a pretty important one in 2024, SB 567.
More acronyms. Got to keep up with all these.
I know, right?
So what did SB 567 do? How did it change things for renters in California?
Okay, well, one of the key things it did was to tighten up the rules around no-fault evictions.
Now those no-fault ones.
Yeah, remember, those are the situations where a landlord can evict someone even if they haven't done anything wrong.
Right, like if the landlord wants to move in themselves or do major renovations,
Yes.
even a good tenant could be facing eviction.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying California already had some safeguards for that.
Mm-hmm.
So what did SB 567 add on top of that?
It basically added another layer of accountability for landlords.
Okay.
And gave tenants more power in those situations. So, for example, with SB 567,
Yeah.
if a landlord says they're evicting you or a family member can move in,
Right.
they can't just give you notice
Uh-huh.
and then leave the place empty after you move out.
Ah, so you can't use owner move-in as a sneaky way to get more rent from someone new.
That's the idea. SB 567 is really trying to close those loopholes,
Makes sense.
make sure landlords are being legitimate.
Right.
And if they don't follow the rules,
Mm-hmm.
the tenant might be able to move back in and get their moving expenses paid back.
Wow. That's pretty powerful.
It is. Yeah.
So they got to be honest about their intentions.
Yeah, definitely. What about the rules around renovations? Did SB 567 change anything there?
Yeah, I was curious about that too.
Yes, it did. Remember how we talked about landlords having to be specific about the renovations?
Right?
SB 567 really emphasized that.
Okay.
The landlord has to get all the permits before they give you an eviction notice.
Okay, so no more vague notices about major renovations without any real detail.
Exactly. And they have to give you a copy of those permits
Wow.
and a detailed description of the work they're planning.
So like with the owner move-in evictions, if they
Ah.
don't actually do the renovations, what happens then?
You might have the right to move back in at your old rent.
Wow, it seems like SB 567 really did a lot for tenants facing those no-fault situations.
It did.
Gives them more peace of mind.
Definitely. And more options if things don't go as planned.
Right. So connecting this back to what we talked about earlier, it seems like California is really moving towards more and more tenant rights and protections.
I think that's a fair assessment.
The state's really working to balance things out between landlords and tenants.
Yeah,
They're recognizing that secure and affordable housing is really important
it is.
for people and for communities.
Very important.
And these laws, AB 1482
Yeah.
and SB 567, are a big part of that effort.
Absolutely.
They're giving renters more stability,
Right.
more predictability, and more legal recourse.
It's not just about those two laws, though.
Right.
There are actually a lot of tenant laws in California.
Okay.
Covering all kinds of stuff, like security deposits and habitability standards.
You got me interested now. What else is there that we should be looking into?
Well, one thing we haven't really touched on yet is the eviction process itself. Like what actually happens when a landlord decides to evict someone in California?
Right.
There are specific procedures and timelines they have to follow.
Okay.
And it's really important for both landlords and tenants to understand those.
That makes sense. So if a tenant gets an eviction notice, what can they actually do? Are there ways to fight it?
Those are all great questions, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Okay, so we're back, and now it's time to really dig into the eviction process itself.
Right, the moment everyone dreads.
Yeah, exactly what happens if you actually get that eviction notice.
It can feel like a really scary moment, but knowledge is power in this situation.
For sure.
Understanding your rights, the process, your options, it can make a huge difference.
So let's say you're a tenant in California,
Okay.
and that dreaded notice shows up at your door. What's the first thing you should do?
Take a deep breath, first of all. It's easy to freak out, but just try to stay calm. Read the notice really carefully.
Okay.
Make sure it clearly states the reason for the eviction and how long you have to respond or move out.
And those reasons, they have to line up with the just cause stuff we talked about, right?
Exactly. The landlord can't just make up some reason.
Right.
It has to be a legitimate legal reason, like not paying rent or breaking the lease.
Right. Or one of those no-fault reasons like the owner moving in.
Exactly. And if it's not a real reason, then you have a good reason to fight it.
Okay, so you've read the notice. You see there's a reason for the eviction.
Right.
What's next? Are there any options besides just packing your bags?
Absolutely. There are a couple of things you can do.
Okay.
It depends on the situation. But if you think the eviction is unfair, you have a right to fight back.
Okay.
But before you go down that road, it's worth thinking about if you can maybe work things out directly with the landlord.
So even in this situation, it's good to talk things through.
Communication can really help.
Yeah.
Like if the eviction is for unpaid rent, maybe you can set up a payment plan with the landlord.
Right.
Or maybe there's some misunderstanding about a lease violation that you can clear up by just talking.
Okay, so open communication is the first step.
Right.
But what if that doesn't work?
Right.
Or what if you really think the eviction is completely bogus?
Then you can officially fight the eviction in court, which means you'll file a response to the notice and present your case to a judge.
And that's where all those resources come in handy, right?
Exactly. Things like tenant rights organizations and legal aid clinics and lawyers who focus on tenant law.
Those are the experts.
Right, because the legal system can be pretty complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
Having some professional guidance can be really helpful.
So not really a do-it-yourself situation?
I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay.
Those experts can help you figure out the law, gather evidence, and really advocate for you.
Right. So what happens if a tenant just doesn't respond to the notice?
Right.
Or doesn't fight it in court?
Well, then the eviction process just keeps moving forward.
Okay.
And the landlord can go ahead and file what's called an unlawful detainer lawsuit.
Okay.
And that's basically a legal action to force the tenant out.
So that's serious business.
It is definitely not where you want to end up.
No. And what could happen if they actually file that lawsuit against you?
Well, the worst case scenario is you could get forcibly removed from your home.
Right.
which is obviously really disruptive and stressful.
Yeah, for sure.
But it can also have long-term consequences because an eviction can stay on your record for years.
Oh, wow.
And that can make it much harder to find a new place to rent.
Yeah, I can see that.
A lot of landlords check for that.
Right. So it's a big deal.
It is, yeah. So being proactive and informed really matters here.
Yeah. Don't just ignore that notice hoping it'll go away.
No, definitely not take it seriously. Know your rights and get help if you need it.
Right. And even better if you can avoid it altogether.
The best defense is a good offense, as they say.
Yeah. So stay informed about your rights. Keep the lines of communication open with your landlord. Do what you're supposed to do according to your lease.
Exactly.
Okay. So to sum it all up for our listener, if you get an eviction notice in California, don't panic.
Right.
Read it carefully. Think about your options. If you think it's unfair, try to work it out with the landlord or get legal help to fight it. And remember, knowing your rights and taking action early can often prevent these situations from happening in the first place.
That's great advice.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, but obviously it's a complex topic.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface, really.
Right. So we encourage you to keep learning about it, find more resources, stand up for your rights as a renter.
Absolutely.
We've talked about all the legal stuff, but as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with this thought. What are the human stories behind all this? What are the real-life consequences of eviction for people and communities? This deep dive is just the beginning, and we hope it helps you understand the rental world a little better and feel more confident about your rights.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.